it live. And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio. We are very privileged to be speaking with Ashley Baker. Ashley Baker has been on this program before, so she's a friend of the show, shall we say. She's Director of Public Policy at the Committee for Justice, and much of her work, as you'll see on her Twitter or all over the internet space, is on the intersection of the courts, regulation, and technology, and she tweets at @AndAshleySays. Ashley, thanks so much for coming back to Consumer Choice Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So one thing that David and I were able to discuss last week for our program was a little bit about the antitrust hearings. I wish we could have dedicated many hours to this. There are so many nuggets in there, so many things to discuss, to ridicule, and to try to understand. You are someone who is much more versed into the legalistic arguments around why these hearings are there in the first place and what's happening. If you could just give us a sense for all of our listeners, what is this antitrust hearing about, and what does antitrust have to do with Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google in the 21st century?
I mean, the general question of what congressional hearings are for, and at this point, no one really knows. Do they resolve all the questions were obviously completely relevant, as even an outside observer could see. I'm being a bit sarcastic there. I think, they wanted to haul four CEOs out in front of the American public on TV and ask them a lot of questions and air their grievances, and a lot of them had nothing to do with antitrust. That's not to say there weren't a couple of legitimate questions in there, but they were very few and far between, and certainly the members did a lot more talking, and then the CEOs really got a chance to. Some at one point during the hearing, you saw particularly the Democratic side just kind of using up all of their own time to air their grievances, and on the right of center, they had some of the same complaints as the left, but also some similar complaints, and a lot of them were related to things such as content moderation and privacy, and equality and workers' rights, and these issues that aren't directly tied to antitrust or to the purpose of the hearing. And there are also a lot of things, and this kind of is the case with any of these hearings involving CEOs of companies. The CEO is usually not the person that you really want to be asking these questions to anyway. You want someone who oversees compliance day to day, for example, for like privacy, if that's your hearing topic, or you need a market expert. You need someone who actually has expertise. It's not that their opinions aren't helpful to, or their answers aren't helpful too, but when you also have very unhelpful questions, and most of them weren't even questions, it was kind of a spectacle, then it really was not a productive hearing. And if the point of this hearing was to go towards the House Judiciary Committee over the past year, they've opened up an investigation into these companies, and they're looking at potentially anti-competitive or monopolistic practices, but really looking more so at how maybe our antitrust laws should be changed in order to address an era of big tech, and whether or not our antitrust laws are suited for that. And very little of what was in that hearing actually would be of any help whatsoever in answering those questions and of putting together a report, or conducting an investigation. I think it was increasingly clear that why have a hearing in the first place if Cicilline had already thought that they were all monopolies. I think there was a conclusion before it began.
Yeah, that makes sense. Reclaiming my time, by the way.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask real quick before I hand it over to David is the idea that Apple has its own app store that they created and they open up to developers, and then they charge them a commission to be on the store. And the idea that Amazon opens up its platform for third-party sellers, allows them to come on, they have to pay a certain fee. Why is this considered like super monopolistic behavior? Because this came up multiple times in the hearing. Is this against the law? I thought this was just like how markets worked. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you say?
No, it's not against the law. I mean, what happened is, sometimes also whenever things take place on the internet, suddenly it's treated differently. You walk into a CVS or to a Costco, and they have their own brands of products as well that they also market, first and foremost to consumers. And you also have to think of the other side. So this gets to a larger question that we don't really have time to get much into right now, but of the multi-sided nature of these markets, and how it's not just your traditional one-sided transaction, but you have also on the other hand, the sellers do get a lot out of being for example on the Apple platform. They not only reach a wider audience, but also there are perks when it comes to having an app that's less buggy than it otherwise would be. There are a lot of technical upsides of having one platform. There's more than one, by the way. There's the Google Play Store. There are other operating systems. Microsoft has its on, and as we can all see today, Microsoft wasn't a huge monopoly just because they controlled the internet browser. They're not controlling the rest of the internet right now either.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed is that we kind of have this unholy alliance of the further left or progressive side of the Democratic Party with Trump-style populists very consistently making the argument that these companies are too big and that they need to be broken up as a result of their size. What's your response to that argument? Does it hold any water, or is it really just kind of silly grievances at this point?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it certainly is an unholy alliance, and it also goes against a lot of economic and legal learning that has led us to this point in antitrust law. There's a lot of history that's being thrown away here, and there are also a lot of principles at stake here. So, I mean, particularly on the right of center, we believe, that the law should be weaponized for purposes other than what that law is intended for, specifically in this case, antitrust. And that's what we're seeing. And there's also, on the right of center, not this presupposition that big is bad. And that sort of presupposition is kind of what led us to develop the consumer welfare standard in the first place too. And early days of antitrust enforcement, it didn't really work very well as a starting point when they said antitrust law. I think what the court said was it was to protect small dealers and worthy men, but that has nothing to do with price point and with how it affects the consumer. So it took nearly a century of economic and legal learning to arrive at where we are today, and there's a lot that's being thrown away.
Yeah, I think if you could explain consumer welfare standard, and because that was brought up a couple of times, obviously you've written about that in a letter that we will get to in a little bit. But what did that mean in the context of the hearing? Because as far as I know, a lot of these products are either free, things like Facebook, or pretty much are just marketplaces for buying a lot of stuff, like Apple, Amazon, whatever. What is consumer welfare standard in this case?
Right, that raises a lot of interesting questions, but consumer welfare standard isn't necessarily just about price either. Consumer welfare standard is more of this kind of broader goal of the antitrust system. And the term itself is a little bit of a misnomer, and there's a debate between whether or not it's total economic welfare or if it's welfare for the consumer. It arguably could be both, but for the purpose of today's discussion, it is how the consumer and the market benefits by certain behavior, and also it's this neutral underlying standard in which the law has developed around in order to have a goal of the law itself, because antitrust law really didn't have much of a goal before that other than whatever the enforcers wanted it to be.
Awesome. And on that, so when it comes to some of your work on this, I know that you've been involved with the Alliance on Antitrust. Can you give our listeners a run through of what that group does and its purpose and what your role is with it?
Sure. So the Alliance on Antitrust is a coalition of nonprofits. It's not a separate entity in and of itself. It's a group of like-minded organizations that my organization, the Committee for Justice, has started. And the point of the Alliance on Antitrust is to reiterate a lot of these principles, particularly conservative principles. These are all conservative or right of center free market groups. And we're trying to reiterate to Congress these points that are being lost in the antitrust debate. Because right now, the antitrust debate, you're seeing, all of these issues related to content moderation and privacy and everything but antitrust, filter over into it. And we're trying to kind of reiterate that this debate's lost its it's lost sight of the primary goal of antitrust, and we're worried about the politicization of the law itself. And these are all groups that want to stand up for the rule of law, which is a very conservative principle, and we think that's very much undermined when this is politicized. And we don't want to see, we don't want to return back to the 60s and 70s of antitrust enforcement where it's being used for all these socioeconomic purposes that have nothing to do with antitrust. So we're trying to reiterate really what's at stake in this debate and also provide some education on the history of antitrust law, educate the public, send letters to Congress as we have recently. This launched last week, the first week of August, and We're off to a pretty strong start with about 15 different organizations and individuals, and we've grown by one or two every day, it seems, since then. So I think this is a common sentiment among people who there isn't really a very good forum for some of these organizations to express these ideas that isn't already kind of contaminated, so to speak, with these other tech policy issues that just have nothing to do with antitrust. So we're trying to make it just about antitrust.
So the website is allianceonantitrust.org, by the way. David, I'll let you go.
And I have a follow-up just specifically on talking to conservatives, because for me, for conservatives, I mean, I put them more on the populist side of politics, the ones who support intervention in this context. But do you find that there's a blind spot for many of those who are in favor of intervention, whether it's on censorship or antitrust or anything in terms of tech? Maybe a blind spot in the realization that whatever power they enable government today under Trump is just going to be used by whomever they don't want to be president down the road. I don't know if that has resonated in your conversations. You would know far better than us because you're actively engaging that side of the aisle. But do they not? Is there just a giant blind spot, or are they naive to the fact that Joe Biden could be president in just a few months' time, and whatever powers you're giving government ultimately fall under what could be a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on about all that. I will point out that, most conservatives aren't under the, populist antitrust umbrella. I know you probably have maybe a bit of that misconception because the debate's also dominated by those who are the loudest, and those happen to be the loudest right now. And that's actually what our coalition is for, is to give the more traditional conservative groups a voice on preserving some of these things. And we all realize that, yes, this would be a huge strategic blunder. I mean, like I just said, going back to the 60s and 70s, where it's used to enforce environmental law, equality, a lot of these are kind of leftist agendas as well. And it's a strategic blunder in a way. I guess an imperfect analogy I've made recently is kind of like Harry Reid giving away the filibuster is a huge problem for the Democrats down the road. This would be even worse than that. And that's considered kind of one of the more, one of the bigger political blunders of the past couple of decades. And I think this would be absolutely catastrophic in the long run, because we've made a lot of progress on antitrust compared to where we were in the 60s and 70s. And if you look at other areas of the law too, they've kind of ballooned out of control by the left driving litigation. And when it comes to areas such as environmental law and other areas of tort law and product liability law, it's really driven by litigation from the left, and you have the law ballooning into something that it wasn't. And with antitrust, we've actually been able to kind of roll it back into what its purpose originally was, and just giving up those decades of progress would be a huge mistake.
Yeah, there's a write-up on this allianceonantitrust.org here on Axios, and in one they quote, who do they quote here? Someone who's on the panel, and Ken Buck, Representative Ken Buck, Republican on the antitrust panel, told Axios that he too thought the government should leave American companies alone until his panel spent a year investigating the platforms. So he says in this quote that essentially he saw so much, quote, anti-competitive behavior and dominant positions in the marketplace. Again, I think it's very hard for a lot of our listeners to conceive of this. I mean, this is not like the oil monopolies of the late 1800s and early 1900s. These are tech companies that have real competition and have to fight for their space on the internet. And at one point, Zuckerberg said, look, if we don't fight for what we're doing, we'll be replaced by a number of groups like within a year. Like, it can happen, right?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of this is the nature of competition. Of course, they're shielding themselves from competitors, and that's absolutely not illegal. I mean, the European system, for example, that's completely different, in which their antitrust law, does work against, harm to other competitors. Here, it's about the consumers. And when you hear statements such as that, how often do you hear the consumers even mentioned? And I would like to, know a little bit more detail about what he meant by that, about the year of investigation. I guess we'll find out eventually if that yielded anything, or if, like I said, they had a conclusion before the process started. But this is really about the consumer, and it's really hard to argue that the consumers are not better off today than they were years ago.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's, whenever people are making these arguments that these companies have near monopolies. I flash back, and our listeners can Google most of these headlines. Just Google the old headlines about MySpace. Many people who are listening will be like, wait, well, what the heck is MySpace? But I'm old enough to know when you had your top friends and you had maybe had a couple music clips that you really liked. And that was like the bee's knees of social media. And everyone was freaking out that MySpace was just too big and that we maybe needed to break up MySpace because we couldn't envision a world where MySpace wasn't the dominant social media platform. And I think that lends to Zuckerberg's point is if they don't keep innovating or keep changing their models or keep pushing to do different things or be more friendly in terms of their interface with consumers and their customers, depending on the platform, they're ultimately going to end up like MySpace. Are there other examples historically where you've seen kind of companies that we once thought, or examples of anything in the tech space where we once thought they were going to basically dominate the market forever, and then eventually they fell away or disappeared?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are many of them in a lot of industries, and it's kind of hard to think of some of them because they have disappeared, as you said. You can actually look at a lot of interesting old headlines from like Forbes and other publications. One about breaking up Yahoo, for example. AOL is one. There are ones outside the tech industry, and GM was seen as a huge threat at one point, and then Toyota kind of built better model at another point. So you see it in the auto industry. You've seen this throughout the years in every major United States industry. I would note that all of these major industries are located in the U.S. for a reason, and part of that is because of the flexibilities our antitrust laws have allowed, unlike the system in Europe.
Yeah, you're definitely
Yeah.
right there. Every single 6 months, we can look forward towards a 1.3 or 1.5 billion dollar fine that comes from the EU on American tech companies. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah. I mean, I go back to in university, and Yaël will remember me back from these days. I was the guy who held on to his BlackBerry phone for way too long. But there was a time where BlackBerry dominated the mobile market, and people forever thought that they were just going to be a big player and that was never going to change. And then through competition, a little bit different than some of the tech space and platform discussions we're having. But again, the kind of principles hold true that if these companies don't keep innovating, they ultimately end up like
Yeah,
Blockbuster.
we like to call David an economic nationalist. He was supporting Canada in this endeavor. That's why he held on so long to his precious BlackBerry.
Yeah.
I have a great analogy. I guess it's pretty relevant to you guys. I know your president or director, Fred, I actually met him during an exchange program I don't even want to say how many years ago, about 16 years ago. We used to talk via AIM, and without AIM, how would I ever get in touch with Fred now? I've lost track of all of you guys. There's no replacement.
Better send a letter on the Pony Express.
Right.
It's so interesting that this is happening in the era of the pandemic, in which all of these companies have proven incredibly essential. Just from my own angle, I've been able to communicate with many friends and my family back home whom I have not been able to see for months. Amazon packages being able to ship things to our house, Apple devices being able to stay connected and talk to friends, Google, pretty much everything. My brain. It's just so crazy to think that this is in the big moment in time where we come to criticize these companies and we want to slap this antitrust thing on them when we're in the middle of a pandemic where all of these things have proven so much value to consumers. And I think that's why it's very important to bring up what you said, Ashley, is like, where's the actual interest for the consumer here? Because I'm looking around and we're all pretty happy.
Yeah, and that's what the real issue is. But it does go to show, too, that antitrust, and it has been in the past, too, has been kind of a microcosm of other societal issues. I know in Bork's Antitrust Paradox, for example, when he wrote the new forward to it, I think it was in 93 or something, 15 years after its previous version, he was kind of reflecting on that and how what Nadler said during the Microsoft investigations about this being more than a wonky legal issue, or basically that it's more than just the substance of antitrust. And then that's when things started to catch on with the antitrust fervor at the time. It does reflect kind of this societal impulse to go after these companies for reasons that aren't related to antitrust.
And I actually want to ask one question on Nadler, because he's obviously like one of the worst, representatives ever.
The worst is an understatement. The
Yeah.
worst is an understatement.
Yeah, one of the worst. By the way, it's thanks to the fairness doctrine that we can say that on talk radio. I have to bring that up on talk radio at least once a week. That's the rule. One thing about him is he went after Zuckerberg, and it was in the context of them buying Instagram. And, they pull these email documents of how Zuckerberg is saying, yeah, we totally got to crush these guys. We got to figure out how to own it. And Nadler makes it seem like it's a slam dunk, whereas everyone else who's listening to this is just like, wow, they made a really smart decision. Facebook invested in this. They connected it with their technology, with their developers, and they made it pretty awesome. But it seems like the Nadler fans and those of that ilk who are interested in going against these companies see that as a win for their side. What does the law say with antitrust when it comes to something like, a huge purchase of a thing like Instagram? It seems as if the law would not crack down on that, but again, maybe we're reading it wrong.
It's hard to say. I mean, this is also, it goes back, this is really just a hearing tactic too. These, hot documents or whatever you want to call them in various contexts. I mean, you see these during judicial confirmations, any other sort of, major public hearing when you have, some snippets of emails that are somewhat out of context, just enough to, lead the public believe one thing or another. And part of it sounded a little bit like Zuckerberg was actually kind of kidding. And, they do use this kind of like boyish, like almost mafia-like sort of like language when emailing back and forth, which doesn't really help the situation when, you have a congressman going after them, reading that out loud on TV. But no, I don't see anything that, was illegal there. And I think if you were to break those up, you would lose, a lot of efficiencies, a lot of benefits there that you have with, having more resources when these things are, put together.
Yeah, I know that for the Consumer Choice Center organization, there's too much power in Canada, so we're going to have to break it up, split David Clement up into multiple parts using the law, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess one of our last questions for you before we wrap up is just, where do you see this going? What are your thoughts on how this discussion is going to progress over, let's say, the next 3-4 months, and then what does this look like after the presidential election?
So, I mean, some of this is hard to say. There are a lot of moving pieces in this discussion, and as I've reiterated, there are a lot of things that aren't related to antitrust. So it's hard to predict exactly. I mean, what the events are kind of more immediately on the horizon, as you see, Nadler's report, the House Judiciary Committee report, which I said probably already had a conclusion. This is just like impeachment and the investigation of Barr, by the way. Both of those were pointed out by Republicans as being of having a conclusion from the beginning. So I think that'll probably prove to be true with this as well. So there should be a report coming out of that, as well as potentially some charges from the Department of Justice. We also have the state attorneys generals doing their own investigation of various practices. California, as a separate state, has joined in with their own investigation. And it's also a consumer issue in that all of these overlapping duplicative investigations are wasting a lot of resources. In terms of the election, it's really hard to say because it's odd that you have two candidates right now who have similar views on this. So how that would work and how things would if let's say if Biden was elected president, how things would happen in terms of the investigation with the transition from a new DOJ and FTC to the old one, whether or not things would be slowed down or much different. It's hard to say there, but I mean, I think this antitrust is continuing to be the core part of the debate, and it's been part of a larger trend over the past year when Congress and regulators haven't been able to get much done on these other tech issues such as Section 230 and privacy. They have just seen antitrust as a convenient regulatory tool, and that's why now they're targeting it because of past failures.
106.7 FM here on the Big Talker, Consumer Choice Radio. We've been speaking with Ashley Baker, Director of Public Policy at the Committee for Justice. You can follow her on Twitter @AndAshleySays. Also go to the allianceonantitrust.org. Ashley, thanks so much for speaking with Consumer Choice Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.